start with.
Oh yeah, don't worry about that. On the way in.
We're going to start with John Diefenbacher Krall, who in 2009 wrote or helped craft the statement of repudiating the doctrine of discovery for the USA Episcopalians. And John has also been active in a number of other things in his home state of Maine, and also helped with crafting the repudiation statement for the World Council of Churches. So thanks, John, for coming.
Thank you. First, I want to acknowledge Onondaga territory. Thank the Onondaga people for being a guest in your land. Also, is Betsy Lyons still here? I just wanted to mention that her.
Oh, you're so good.
Wanted to mention that Tanya Ganell-Fritzner has been a guest in our home back in Old Town, Maine, and I also was one of her invited guests when she received an honorary degree from Colby College in Waterville, Maine, a few years ago. And I'm sure we all send our prayers out for Tanya's return to good health. I've got a lot of connections to this area, central New York. I went to Colgate University in Hamilton. Many of my family live in this area. I have a niece who lives in Syracuse, and I stayed last night with my brother and sister-in-law in Cicero. But also connection that lake. Several people have talked about sitting up here and being able to look out on Onondaga Lake, that terribly polluted lake. What a act of sacrilege by settler population to the Onondaga and the Haudenosaunee. And we have something very similar in Maine. We have Onondaga Nation and the lake, Onondaga Lake. Back in Maine, we have the Penobscot Indian Nation and the Penobscot River, the largest river in Maine, the second largest watershed in all of New England, and we have the same pollution, a chloralkali plant, a plant that uses mercury to produce chlorine and caustic soda or soda ash, a plant built in Orrington, Maine on the east bank of the Penobscot River, just below Bangor and Brewer, that dump tons and tons. So you have the most polluted lake in the United States. We have perhaps the most polluted mercury river in the world, in the Penobscot River. And some connection, I used to work for a large organization called the Maine People's Alliance, and we brought a lawsuit with the Natural Resource Defense Council to cause the polluter to clean that river up. And I actually filed the lawsuit in federal district court in 2000 on behalf of the lawyers. And we're still battling. Just as the Onondaga Nation and the people of this area are battling against Allied Chemical, now Honeywell, we're battling Mallinckrodt to get that mercury out of the Penobscot River. That's contaminating fish, songbirds, it's affecting the whole food web in the lower Penobscot River. I also can connect, Betsy mentioned her son, talking about who tells the fish about the mercury, who speaks for the fish. Kind of reminds me of the Lorax. But I had a similar feeling. I'm an avid angler. In fact, tomorrow, I'm not going to be here for Sunday mornings. I'm going to be fly fishing in West Canada Creek, so something I'm passionate about doing. But I remember early time taking my son ice fishing, and we have a mercury health advisory for all waters in the state of Maine. And I couldn't responsibly, as my son's father, feed him the pickerel or yellow perch that we were going to catch from that lake. And I wrote an op-ed in the Bangor Daily News, the largest daily circulation newspaper in the state of Maine. They're talking about that, what a taking. And then I can't pass that on to my son in completing that. There's a place for catch and release fishing. I do it a lot. But there's also a wonder about sustaining your family from something that you gather, that you catch. And I can't do that in the state of Maine because of that pollution. Phil talked about some of his early remarks about 10 years ago, really how it crystallized for him, though he'd been teaching about colonialism and religion's part in that, but the doctrine of discovery. And it wasn't much later that myself, Phil, also had. I can't remember the moment. A lot of people have asked me, the graduate student that I know you're advising, May Elizabeth Brew, interviewed me earlier this year. I wish I had, St. Paul on the road to Damascus moment where I could tell you this was the minute. I don't know that. I do remember getting inspired by an article in Indian Country Today about the protests at their Butte, and many of those indigenous peoples calling on the Pope and the Catholic Church to renounce the papal bulls. But I know I got inspired. I've done a lot of activist work in my career. I've worked on environmental issues and for universal single-payer health care, for finance reform, political campaigns, just a number of issues. But gosh, when you look at this issue, the doctrine of Christian discovery, as the chair of the Maine Indian Tribal State Commission told me recently, indigenous person said, you kind of think of this as the why of all whys. Why were indigenous peoples dispossessed? Why does colonialism still practiced by states in the world today? Even though the United Nations condemned it in 1960, we're not in a post-colonial period. We still live with colonialism every single day. Part of my day job, I want to be clear, I'm speaking here totally individually, but my day job is I'm the executive director of the Maine Indian Tribal State Commission, and I'm dealing with the legacy of a land claim settlement in 1980, the Maine Indian Land Claim Settlement, and I see those colonial dimensions every single day. But I got inspired, and in doing anti-racism work, there's a lot of important things we have to do, and I was glad towards the end of Joe's talk, he said the word racist, because this is very much a racist type of worldview, policy, international law. And when we're doing anti-racism work, there's a lot of work, both the people who are the racists or have been privileged by an atmosphere of racism existing, and of course the people who have been exploited or oppressed by that racism. I think especially me as an Episcopalian, as a Christian, there's fundamental work that I felt I need to do within the Episcopal Church to undo its contribution. And I'm really thankful to Joe, because one of the things I've been mindful of in doing this work, I don't want to just point fingers at the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has a lot to be responsible for. And there's been a bunch of indigenous folks, Orrin Lyons and Steve Newcomb and others, bringing that right to the Vatican. And I'm also hopeful, like Joe Heath said, that perhaps Pope Francis can take a different position than his predecessors and acknowledge all those papal bulls. They weren't totally rescinded. That's the line out of the Vatican by the 1537 papal bull, but I'm sorry. All those other papal bulls are still out there. And I don't see why it would be such a simple act, why the Catholic Church cannot say this is wrong. But we've got plenty of blame in the Episcopal Church, and that's where I especially wanted to focus on that 1496 Cabot Charter. And so after I preached a sermon at St. James Episcopal Church in Old Town, Maine, this is the first time I spoke out about this, and I challenged my congregation, I challenged the Episcopal Diocese of Maine, I challenged the entire Episcopal Church, and you may know that the Episcopal Church is part of something called the Anglican Communion. And I wanted all of them to repudiate, to renounce, to dismantle the doctrine of discovery. So we started, in the natural place, we started with the Episcopal Diocese of Maine. Every year, our diocese, people from all the churches come together, we have a convention. It generally happens in October. And I made sure that I got elected to be a delegate, representative for my church. We sponsored a resolution number 2. And part of that, I want to read just a part of that resolution. This was before Episcopalians in October 2007 resolved that the Diocese of Maine submit a resolution for consideration at the Episcopal Church General Convention of 2009, putting the 76th General Convention of the Episcopal Church on record, calling upon the Archbishop of Canterbury for the Church of England and the Supreme Governor of the Church of England, the Queen of England, to disavow and rescind the claimed validity of the doctrine of discovery against all peoples, specifically as set forth in the 1496 English Royal Charter granted to John Cabot and his sons. And that passed. I wish it passed by more. It was much closer than I would have liked. I'm active in the Episcopal Church, and maybe those of you who are people of faith, actively practicing your spirituality within a Christian denomination. You know, when a big political issue comes in, and it's not just within churches, I think in any human institution or group, there's often kind of cautious. You know, what is this? And a reticence to embrace the issue. And I think that somewhat hurt us at the Episcopal Convention in 2007. But thankfully, there were enough voices, my voice and others, that it prevailed by about 30 votes. Too close, I would have felt stunned. Steve Newcomb, I want to give him lots of credit. Steve worked with me very closely on the wording, because the wording is very important. Words have caused such terrible problems and crimes in the world, and I did not want to add to that. I wanted to make things better. So I really want to credit Steve for his help with me. So after that, I'm a longtime community organizer. I've been an executive director of a large progressive organization. I used to work for an organization in this state you might know, Environmental Advocates. It used to be known as the Environmental Planning Lobby. So I know something about how to run campaigns, and I know Maine is a small state and there's relatively few Episcopalians in all of the Episcopal Church. It would be a lot more helpful if I could get some other dioceses to be also thinking about this doctrine of discovery. So I reached out to Episcopalians in the Diocese of Central New York, which essentially goes from Syracuse down to Binghamton, and they essentially drafted a resolution very similar to the one in Maine, and they passed it in November 2008. So this is good. We've got the Episcopal Diocese of Maine, we've got the Episcopal Diocese of Central New York, so we have some momentum going into that convention. And so I and the Episcopal Committee on Indian Relations, we drafted wording for the Episcopal Church Convention in 2009. I also want, again, Steve Newcomb was working very closely with us. And something, Phil, you said that I also agree with you is very important about that resolution that was passed by the Episcopal Church. This is the entire Episcopal Church in the world in July 2009, was that they're finding that the doctrine of discovery fundamentally opposed to the gospel of Jesus Christ. How we ever in the room has heard of Jesus Christ, and we all have different views of who Jesus Christ was as a human being and perhaps as a divine figure. But just for as an Episcopalian, as a Christian, that's the crux or the core of why we call ourselves Christian, is that human being, that Son of God. And in the Episcopal service, every service we hear from Scriptures. We always have a reading from the Gospels, the four Gospels, which often are the direct, the words, quote unquote, of Jesus Christ. So it's a very high authority. For making that finding, I thought was very important. Also, not just to appeal perhaps to the progressives and liberals in the Episcopal Church, but also to speak more to the fundamentalists. Because this is not just liberals bringing into the church some political cause. Here's the basis of our faith, the gospel. And we're saying this is opposed to the gospel. That's a really profound finding. And I would thank Bishop McDonald, who's the bishop of the Indigenous peoples in the Anglican Church of Canada, really made that contribution to the resolution. I think it's really profound and very important. So that happened in 2009, and I've been involved in a lot of political campaigns. In fact, I was talking to my family early this morning, telling my parents-in-law when I would arrive at their home tonight in Fairfield, New York, and I was looking at the sign for the 1986 Environmental Quality Bond Act. I actually ran a statewide campaign promoting that bond act. which created the biggest state Superfund program in the nation, and apparently paid for some of this place for land and park acquisition. But I was surprised, even with all the experiences I've had working in 3 states, of how this kind of caught fire, what the Episcopal Church did. And it resulted in the Anglican Church of Canada in 2010, you had the United Church of Christ, you had the Methodists, and I was privileged to work with Robert Miller, who we're going to hear from, I think, later today, right, Phil? And Sarah Augustine and Steve Newcomb. We all worked on that resolution in the World Council of Churches in February 2012. So this has been gratifying, and I'm glad that the churches are getting it. But of course, the hard work that we have before us is, how do we get beyond the statements? Because the statements are important, because as we sing Joe Heath and others have so eloquently, we've got a religious concept in the bedrock of federal Indian law. And to me, it's so ironic. We have such fierce debate in the United States about separation of church and state. And yet here, people are just ignorant of the fact that federal Indian law rests on a religious concept. So it's important that the churches have made these statements, but what do we do next? You know, part of it is, I was asked by, I know, a person of high regard in this room and all over the world, and that's Warren Lyons, at the North American Indigenous Caucus in 2012, he had me in a hotel room in Niagara Falls, Canada, and said, John, you must make sure that the resolutions passed by the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Church of Canada get read into the record at the UN Permanent Forum in 2012. You might recall that year the Permanent Forum special theme was the Doctrine of Discovery. There were a lot of powerful statements submitted there. And, okay, Warren Lyons asked me to do this. I didn't want to have another long record of white people with broken promises. We had it set up, though, to have the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, Catherine Shorey. To her credit, she sat in the permanent forum for probably about 6 hours over 2 days. The bishop is pretty busy, not that other people aren't. She just couldn't be there anymore. And I have to admit, after the second day of the permanent forum, I felt deflated. And I thought, I'm just another long line of a lot of white guys who make promises to indigenous people and don't follow through. But I stayed in the room, and we know there's a lot to be said for tenacity and hanging in there. And I was surprised on Wednesday, the 3rd day of the permanent forum, Grand Chief Ed John, who's the North American representative of the permanent forum, somebody says, and now we will hear the intervention from the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Church of Canada. Well, Bishop Shorey's long gone. I was the guy who actually wrote the intervention, so I got myself a microphone and entered it. And so we were able to add statements Steve Newcomb and Robert Miller and the Haudenosaunee and the whole. We really piled on at that. If there was any doubt about the role of the Doctrine of Discovery, it was totally wiped out after the 12th permanent forum, because there were just so many powerful statements. The evidence is just incontrovertible that this is a huge problem. You know, I came here today, I drove about 560 miles from Old Town, Maine to be here today at the invitation of Phil. In part, you know, I really appreciated the work of Phil and Mary McDonald and the Doctrine of Discovery Study Group, because it is kind of lonely. Not many people know about the Doctrine of Discovery. You know, part of my personal ministry as an Episcopalian Christian is letting people know about this. So I preach quite often. Last Sunday I preached at the Unitarian Universalist Church in Yarmouth, Maine about this. Got a really good reaction. I wasn't surprised. Almost everyone in the room said, I've never heard of this before. I don't know about this. And so last year I preached in the United Church of Christ, and I preached in the Unitarian Universalist Church in Ellsworth, and I preached in the Episcopal Church in Mount Desert Island, Maine. So that's part of what I'm doing. But I think I like the, second to last slide that Joe Heath showed us, and that was talking about Plessy versus Ferguson. Because in terms of the civil rights movement in this country, that was such a terrible decision, right? Separate but equal. And it took until Brown versus Topeka, Kansas in 1954 to overturn that. Well, my mind, and I told Phil this, that is one orientation I have. I really think that we need to overturn Johnson versus McIntosh. Now that's no light undertaking, and we have to respect the Indian bar, and they told us, and they're right, look at who's on the US Supreme Court. We don't have, maybe Sonia Sotomayor might get it. It's pretty bleak, the rest of the people are on that Supreme Court. So it's going to take us decades. Part of it is getting some justices on there. We need a Thurgood Marshall on Indian law. We need several of them. At least if we start, we finally have at least one indigenous judge just recently confirmed by the United States Senate to Arizona. One out of all the hundreds of US jurors that we have. So it'll take that. And we're going to need something, I think, like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund that very strategically won cases until finally, Brown just didn't suddenly happen. It was decades of work. I would like to be part of that work. I'm not a lawyer. I do know a lot about this stuff. I do have some experience working on campaigns and working with the media. I think what we need, though, beyond these statements, and they're very important, I hope we keep doing them. It's good that church activists have done this. We really need to build a movement among the whole US population. People need to know about the doctrine of discovery as much as they know about Jim Crow or the civil rights movement or other dark days or slavery in United States history. They need to be as conversant, and there needs to be a groundswell and loud voices that this is wrong, this must change. So I know that the reason probably you're here to be as part of that. I'm here to gain strength, to share ideas, and hopefully we can build that movement to make this change. Thank you.